Let me begin by thanking you, Dean, first of all, for the invitation to join you here this evening. And it's my first time in your new building, because I think the last time that I had the opportunity to meet some of you was about 7 years ago in the old building, when the Hertie School was still at the stage of being an entrepreneurial vision, if I may put it that way, and also a visionary proposition for something very unique here in Germany. And I want to begin by congratulating you and many of you who have been part of making this idea of a school on governance become a reality. I think it benefits Germany, I think it benefits the subject of governance, and I think it also enriches a city such as Berlin. So congratulations on, I think, what will be the 10th year. And to all of you who are here, I hope that you feel that your choice of having chosen the Hertie School will prove to be one that you will never regret and hopefully remember with fond memories. Before I begin, I also want to acknowledge that I feel a little bit under pressure tonight, because to my left sits Professor Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker, who not only is in many ways a visionary in his own right, but also a mentor in ways that he may never realize to the journey that I have taken in this work. And above all, I also want to recognize him because he is somebody who not only in his own right and the work that he has done on many of the issues I will address tonight, but also currently co-chairs the International Resources Panel, which, based on what you have just referred to, the new Thai focus perhaps of the Hertie School, is somebody, and with the panel also, that I hope will enrich your discussions here also. It is a remarkable panel of leading scientists across the world that is focused on the whole question of resource use in a world of 7, 8, 9 billion people and the future of our economies, and an understanding of how we practice resource management. Perhaps the biggest pressure factor tonight is that as I walked in here this evening, my goddaughter suddenly turned up and said, "Oh, I heard you're in town and I'm going to sit and listen to your lecture." So I'm not, there she is on the left. So Franziska, whatever I do, it is to be forgiven. Let me just say that in coming to a lecture like this, it's very tempting to give you, in a sense, an anthology of environmental governance, its evolution, the chronology of instruments, the landscape of 500 multilateral environmental agreements that, in a sense, define the environmental governance landscape that we have today. And this is, in a sense, a body of governance instruments that is remarkable both in its scope, it's remarkable in the number of instruments, but it is also a constant reminder of the continuous struggle of making governance something that actually allows countries to not only come together and agree on problems that need to be addressed, but more importantly, to achieve transformational solutions. And as I was preparing for my talk this evening here, I thought, how do I walk into a room with people such as yourselves, who I don't have to tell you about the realities of international environmental governance, about multilateralism, about the nature of the relationship among sovereign nations at the beginning of the 21st century, in trying to not only address sustainable development agendas, the financial and economic crisis, the instabilities, the risks that preoccupy citizens, decision makers across the planet, but also the seeming inability, as you just pointed out, to actually achieve breakthroughs. We live in a very strange moment in time. The balance sheet that we prepared through the Global Environment Outlook report, in having examined 90 of the globally agreed environmental goals, and the very sobering realization that in only 4 of them had we actually made breakthroughs, could lead us to declare the whole environmental governance efforts of the last 40 years a failure. Similarly, when you look at conferences such as Rio +20, but not only those, the climate conferences, the trade negotiations, the next reflex reaction is to also declare multilateralism a failure, the attempt to try and bring through international conferences and negotiations a global community of 193 or more nations together to agree on a way forward has not exactly been either seen or has functioned in a very effective manner. What strikes me also is that when we come back to the environmental field, that in a sense it's seen as a failure of the environmental community, or it is even seen as a failure of the environmental governance instruments, that these breakthroughs have not happened. And I want to tackle that perception head on, because I think we are actually pointing the finger at the wrong issue here. We have very intelligent environmental governance instruments, and if you are in doubt whether they can work, please take a look at the Montreal Protocol And please recognize for a moment that actually we have managed to, in just over 2 decades, to bring the entire global community together and to phase out 99% of the ozone-depleting substances that we had initially identified and others. And in fact, just yesterday, we approved a new project for China that will phase out ozone-depleting substances across the board in China by 2030 with a hard deadline, hard targets, and hard commitments. And that is very significant, and it further reinforces that instruments that are negotiated, where the shared interest, the technology, the financing, and the politics come together, are in fact perfectly capable of delivering results. So what is the problem? The first problem, I think, when we come to environmental governance is that we are, in a sense, trapped in a world where we're trying to solve so-called externalities, as economists have called them, and there is symbolism to this term. Environmental impacts, environmental costs and consequences of development writ large have in large part been viewed as of a secondary importance, as neither existential to humanity nor sufficiently important to question the way our economies work. And it is in the way that our economies work that actually the success or failure of environmental governance is defined. And therefore, one of the areas I will focus on tonight is to, in a sense, highlight the importance of recognizing that environmental governance and addressing environmental sustainability and development is not something that can continue to be defined from a paradigm of protecting the planet against people, which, for very rational reasons and also practical reasons, defined the environmental community's focus on addressing these issues for almost 100 years as the single key objective. How do we make humans less damaging to the planet? And even environmental activism, environmental NGOs, environmental science, for much of the 20th century was essentially knocking on the door of decision-making, which increasingly has become defined by, reduced to, depends on how you want to characterize it, to an economic paradigm that essentially determines all scope for action. It is intriguing to see just a few years after the financial crisis nearly brought the entire global economy to its knees with the financial meltdown, the fact that we have indebted ourselves and probably the next 2 generations with $4,000 to $5,000 billion in a rescue exercise, that if you listen to the news in the evening, the world is almost back in order because Wall Street, the financial markets, the stock exchanges are hitting the numbers that they hit just before the financial crisis began. And herein lies, I think, one of the key moments of, I think, a political but also a policy shift that we can now begin to recognize. If financial markets declare the world as being back in business and all right, when even in a series of economies, such as here in Europe, we face the unemployment rates, the public debt ratios that we now see, the youth unemployment hitting 50% of job market entrants, there is something fundamentally flawed, and that is perhaps nothing new to you. The question is, what happens next? Because the return to business as usual is at the moment the automatic journey we will take. And environmental issues that have a lot to do with the sustainability, and as Ernst and Asher Kosler and their panel are increasingly also demonstrating, the proposition that development can even occur in the years ahead will, and this is one of my key points I want to share with you this evening, will increasingly be premised upon understanding how the relationship between environment and economy in the context of our societies, and therefore also in terms of equity and employment and other such issues, can be redefined. In fact, at the beginning of the 21st century, and with you sitting in this room here and looking at your future perhaps in terms of professional careers, I can only encourage you to be as environmentally literate as you can, because there are enough economists out there. The problem is that most economists are environmentally completely illiterate. And the phenomenon of environmentalism over the last 20 to 30 years is that it has been virtually equally economically illiterate. And therefore, the failure of global environmental governance, of achieving the goals that we set out based on identifying the origins of the problem, the implications of not acting in environmental terms, has failed to recognize that actually decision-making in our society beginning with the confidence of the individual citizen who sits in the evening and watches the evening news, to also the pundits in reinsurance companies, in industrial companies, in mining or energy sectors where investment decisions have to be taken with a 20 to 30 year horizon, are at the moment struggling to try and reconcile what is in a sense a 200-year journey of industrialization, economic progress, GDP growth. We are the richest generation that's ever lived on this planet. And yet we have managed in 100 years to destroy 50% of the world's wetlands. We have managed in just 30 years of industrial scale fishing to affect 70% of the world's fishing stocks in the world's oceans to the point where they're overexploited or collapsing. You just have to, take an image for a moment and look at the timelines. We are also a generation that will grow so fast, first of all, in numbers, secondly, in consumption footprint, and also in where we will live in the coming 20 to 30 years, that we are completely changing the way our societies and therefore their economic footprint will manifest itself. 60% of the urban infrastructure that will be in place by the year 2050 is yet to be built. That is in the next 37 years. We have just passed the point where 50% of the world's population is actually living in cities. So at the same time, we are hitting many of these boundaries, whether it is carbon space, whether it is arable land. We are often talking about food security in our outlook over the next 20 to 30 years. And we are facing many essentially irreconcilable realities. On the one hand, the need for more food. On the other hand, an agricultural economy that is forcing farmers to actually reduce the amount of arable land available by virtue of the market and production systems under which they operate. Industrial scale agriculture in many parts of the world is more akin to a mining exercise than it actually is to using a factor of production sustainably. Whether it is salination of soils, whether it is soil erosion, whether it is desertification, or whether it is even the drawing of water resources in order to introduce irrigated agriculture. We are not practicing a very rational approach to managing a natural resource base at a point in time when, if you want to use that term, planetary boundaries are becoming not just scientific scenarios, they are in fact emerging as absolute realities. And in some of the work of the International Resources Panel, for instance, on rare earth, it was the panel that actually produced a report on rare earth roughly 12 months before rare earth hit the news headlines, and many of us heard about them the first time in our lives. Simply because we were looking in the International Resources Panel at the whole metals use and recycling ratios on our planet. And one of the interesting things we discovered is that rare earths, which are first of all obviously rare, and secondly are so central to many of the technologies that we are today deploying, whether in communications, in the energy sector, in the mobility sector, are currently being recycled at a rate of less than, I think, Ernst, 2%? 1%. And here is a very interesting question. Why is that happening? If economies and if basically businesses and markets and enterprises were so rational, how do we explain that when, in the field of steel and aluminium, recycling rates often go beyond 60, 70%? Because sometimes our economies are very slow at being able to factor in what is, in a sense, a physical reality that traditionally is associated with resource availability and environmental management. And when you then move into the realm of things such as climate change, many people consider international climate policy today a complete failure. And certainly if you look at the meta level of global climate negotiations, Copenhagen will be remembered by most of us as a moment of profound failure. But take a step back for a moment, and this creates the bridge also to my trying to bring, in a sense, a slightly different perspective to the notion of multilateralism. Only 20 years ago, global warming was a phenomenon that most people had neither heard of, and that even in the scientific community was in the realm of possibilities, speculative science, scenario building. It was in the end through the vehicle of the United Nations that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established, which from my vantage point allowed science to progress much faster beyond the control of national interest, a very important principle of multilateralism. It was the IPCC that allowed the work on climate research, on atmospheric research, to begin to be brought into the policy arena. And the IPCC's role was always a non-prescriptive role, therefore it was not threatening to governments. But what it did establish, and by the time it produced its last report, with the predicate unequivocal, the link between human actions and climate change. What Lord Nicholas Stern then also provided, in a sense, flowing from all this awareness about climate change, was the link between climate change as a phenomenon that is happening in the atmosphere and its economic consequences, particularly the cost of inaction. And to me, it is an example of how, first of all, we have to, in a world of 7 billion people, 193 nations, all with their own realities, all with their own scars in terms of history, legacy, challenges about future development, to recognize that the environmental phenomena of change are today increasingly planetary, and that even the largest economy on the planet, take the USA, if it stopped emitting carbon tomorrow, would not in itself be able to arrest global warming and probably the world surpassing the 2-degree boundary. And it is not just in the atmosphere, it is also in the biosphere that we can see this phenomenon of, in a sense, having to act as a collective community of nations, of interests, of economies, increasingly driving or defining the scope for action. Cleaning up your own backyard, environmentalism of the 60s and 70s, banning polluting substances, protecting national parks, restoring wetlands, cleaning up rivers, was, in a sense, the second generation of environmentalism. And it is no less relevant today at the level of local communities, municipalities, and so on. But on top of that entire scope for local action, you now have an imperative that is not one that is defined by 50 or 100 years from now, but an imperative actually that began yesterday to address questions such as global warming, but also the loss of ecosystems, the loss of biodiversity on the planet, and the link, for example, to our food production, our energy systems. In fact, climate change, including through the UN Framework on Climate, the UN Climate Convention, Framework Convention, has become a vehicle within which nations are essentially trying to find an acceptable way to reinvent their entire economies. And this is where the fascinating moment in time is, because if we are going to deal with climate change and global warming as a phenomenon that we need to, in one form or another, change the trajectory for the future, we have to rethink our entire economies. Energy systems, transport systems, but also urbanization, management of buildings. The question of how do you introduce into an economy that has almost gotten drunk over 150 years on cheap fossil fuels, suddenly the notion that you have to pay a real price. How do we also explain that for 20 years it was impossible to talk about a fuel tax or even a carbon tax when then less than 24 months are needed in order to triple the price of a barrel of oil on the global marketplace, and the lights did not go out, the economies did not cease operating. These incongruities between the scientific assessment of the imperative to act and the policy arena, dominated and defined by the economic scope for action that is presented to us every day, is, in a sense, the central arena within which we need to look at environmental governance in the future. Before I move into perhaps highlighting a few examples from a green economy perspective also, let me just for a moment take a step back and also note that one of the interesting phenomena that I think you all are in one form or another, I'm sure, following is an interesting migration across the planet from west to east of the Center for Environmental Policy Making and Progressive Policy Making. I would argue that somewhere between the 1970s and 1985, much of the policy, technology, and investment momentum originated largely in North America and particularly in the United States, whether it is the establishment of an EPA, the phasing out of pollutant substances, environmental legislation, environmental litigation, but also technologies. These, in many ways, were growing out of an economy, out of a society that was ready to take a leap forward. Then somewhere in the mid-80s, the United States stagnated and the focus shifted to Europe. In fact, much of the 90s, Europe was a leader in terms of policy initiatives, also technology frontiers that were being pushed forward, investments that were beginning to take place in public mobility and energy efficiency, even in the field of chemicals, which really was a dominant domain of the United States scientific and pharmaceutical and agricultural products community in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. Suddenly it was the European Union that established REACH, that put regulations in place, and also with the emergence of the European Union as a vehicle that allowed Europe suddenly to make environmental policy making in a very progressive sense possible, because suddenly by joining the European Union and giving the mandate to Brussels also to lead this effort, you could overcome national resistances much more quickly, particularly where lobbyism is involved. And even the new entrants into the European Union, if you look at the crash course program that new entrants into the European Union have to run through in just 4 or 5 years on environmental standard setting, environmental regulations and laws, is phenomenal. None of these new entrant countries would have done this journey in less than 10 to 20 years. And yet by joining the European Union, they were catapulted into a common market where they had to, whether they liked it or not, or in a sense felt comfortable doing it, it had to be done. Then something very interesting has been happening. Europe also has begun stagnating, partly because the European Union in itself has begun to struggle with the complexity of 27 member states. If you see the European Union in negotiating mode at the moment at international negotiations, you see essentially a block of countries that has to spend almost as much time or even more trying to reconcile its positions internally as it is actually able to engage in negotiations with other parts of the world. And that has begun to hurt Europe. It has begun to hurt Europe's leadership. It has also begun to hurt Europe's, if you want, self-confidence in providing leadership. And the climate domain is just one example of that. But the world always has a way of filling these vacuums. And I think if you now take a look from about 2005 onwards, where is the dynamic for policy innovation, for technology innovation, and for investments also beginning to emerge in the environmental and sustainability policy arena? It has jumped almost to Asia. In the context of the financial and economic crisis, UNEP had put forward a global Green New Deal concept, particularly aimed at the G20, to say, if we are going to mortgage our public finances for the next 20 to 30 years in bailing out sectors, stabilizing economies, then a significant part of that should at least go towards not only stabilizing the sectors and the jobs of yesterday's economy, and this is in no way meant to be derogatory, but to also invest in the jobs that will come in tomorrow's economy, a low-carbon economy, a resource-efficient economy, a technology-based economy, in which also employment and jobs are increasingly going to be a scarce commodity. Now, the interesting thing was that, contrary to what would have been traditionally the perception at the end of the 20th century that Europe would have been at the forefront of this, it was actually China that had the largest single package of financial stimulus packages put in place in the green economy sectors. Massive investment in expansion of public transport, building efficiency, renewable energy. In absolute terms, beating easily Europe and the United States. The second country that led this was, in fact, South Korea, which had developed the green growth approach under its president at the time and had put a remarkably systematic set of policies and layers of implementation in place right down to the level of municipalities, and it allocated 80% of its stimulus package towards the green growth paradigm in trying to essentially invest in a technology leap and putting in place the policies. But it is not only that. If you take a closer look, this is a trend that, in a sense, is manifesting itself not only in the brutal, glaring light of economic and numbers of dollars invested figures, it is also a discussion that has to do with the future of development on this planet. It is no coincidence that the gross national happiness indicator that magazines such as The Economist and many economic development professionals laughed at just 10 years ago has become actually a conversation that is permeating throughout Asia. because it is introducing in one way or another, or echoing to a sentiment that I see playing itself out in debates in Thailand, in Vietnam, in China, and in Japan, that is beginning to recognize that the limitations in civilizational terms of a purely economically driven and defined economic pathway begs the question of how is this going to work in 20 or 30 years' time. And if the Communist Party Congress at its last meeting puts the notion of transitioning towards an ecological civilization into one of the central defining concepts for development of China, it is again fascinating to see how natural that discussion becomes in an Asian context, and how, let's say, from the skeptical to the cynical to the disbelieving, that concept is noted in the Western media and in the Western perception. It might surprise you, and you asked me to be a little bit provocative tonight, if I were to look over the next 20 to 30 years, where do I have the greatest confidence that sustainability issues will begin to define economic policy? Then I look with the greatest sense of optimism towards Asia, and particularly East Asia, and China. And that is not some delusional perception. If I had, a day's seminar, I would take you through a number of indicators. And it is not to deny that China has some of the greatest environmental problems today of any country on the planet. And it is not to diminish the significance and the size of the challenge that China will face in the years ahead. But if you look at the systematic approach with which Chinese leadership and also Chinese citizens are now demanding a different prioritization of development, and you look at the systematic nature and the speed at which China is putting in place measures that on average took 2 to 3 times longer in virtually every OECD country to put in place emission controls, pollution standards, public health systems, etc., then you will recognize that our greatest problem may not be, in fact, China. And our greatest problem is today, if you look at multilateralism, that we are trying to confront issues of a planetary nature, even of a civilizational nature, that manifest themselves in different sovereign territories, nation states, nationalism, resource nationalism, many layers to this, but above all, in a paradigm that is almost a direct contradiction to what we're actually in need of at this very moment in time. And that paradigm is premised fundamentally on the notion that we are all competing against each other. If you look at world trade negotiations, if you look at the climate change negotiations, even if you look at something like the Rio summit last year, the underlying notion is that in trying to address something that actually requires collective action, coordinated action, joint action, every nation state approaches these debates and negotiations at the moment with a view that they actually have to outmaneuver the other side. And the West-China dynamic is simply the most visible and the most articulated one, to the point that we are in the media often feeding almost a misperception. Small example. In the last few years, you heard time and again the argument that China is building or bringing into its grid 2 coal-fired power stations every week. I went and looked at these figures a little bit more closely, and what it actually reveals is that, yes, China has an enormous energy deficit. It is really struggling to feed its economy with power. But what it does for every 2 power stations it puts onto the grid, it closes 1 down every week. That's never mentioned in the media. And it is not doing it because it doesn't need them, no, because it is closing down the dirtiest coal-fired power stations and trying to replace them with cleaner technology. This is neither to rationalize China's energy policy. I would never venture to do that in such a short talk, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that as we have built a global economy and as we establish the WTO, we are facing the twin phenomena at the moment that global trade negotiations have stagnated. The great project of building a global economy in which trade will be the singular unifying driver is suddenly begun to stagnate. It is giving way to a re-emergence of bilateral trade agreements. And equally in the climate change negotiations, it is almost inexplainable if you were to put yourself into the shoes of a historian teaching in this very hall here, maybe in the year 2050, to explain the irrationality of climate negotiations in the year 2010, 2011, 2012. Because even if we still debate climate science, let us also be honest, climate change is real. The majority of the world's population believes that it is real. But, and this is our greatest challenge today, people have no confidence that we either have the international wisdom and mechanisms to address this challenge, and that it is actually doable in technology and economically viable terms. And that is where the notion then, often in the daily politics of our societies, tends to migrate into it is the enemy on the other side of the border, on the other side of the world, that is preventing us from acting. And I think it is this economic paradigm of nations only being able to progress in competition with one another that in one form or another we do have to address head-on in the coming years, because it will define the future of multilateralism. It will define the capacity of the planet to actually be able to address phenomena such as food security, energy security, global warming, and also to be able to answer the question of where will jobs come from? Because if the only equation we now have is either jobs go to China or we get the jobs back from China, this is a zero-sum game that doesn't work when you're going to add another 2 billion people to the world's population. So as you, in a sense, study here the Hertie School of Governance, let me appeal to you that the notions that global governance is, maybe the last remnants of a failed dream of the new international economic order or a new world economic order, that essentially multilateralism is dead, that sub-regional configurations of nation states will determine the future of the planet, that these kinds of negative doom and gloom scenarios, I think, are actually misleading. Yes, we will have a differentiation of governance. We will see more regionalism emerge, just as we have seen also in a European Union a debate about subsidiarity. These are natural tendencies in which societies, economies, blocks begin to recalibrate, if you want, their scope for action. But do not let anyone mislead you that the future of our planet will somehow be managed in a sub-regional set of economic blocks and interests, that solutions to the global food security challenge are going to be determined by the marketplace. The marketplace at the moment is hostage to people who have no interest in long-term food security. Actually, they have an interest in destabilizing food markets, because literally overnight you can turn a futures investment into a cornucopia for that particular fund or for that investor. The fact that speculative or even risk-informed interventions in the global food markets mean that the news of a drought in Australia will translate overnight into a 20% food price increase in South America for the basic staple foods, literally means that within minutes we are pricing millions of people out of their basic food access. This is the reality of a global economy at work. And this is not demonizing it, this is how people are behaving rationally. The question is, who sets the conditions within which we operate rationally? And I think the greatest breakthrough, or the liberation, I would almost call it, of our generation in the year 2013 is that we are no longer trapped in this notion that it is either the state that will solve all problems for us, and by extension a global state, nor the delusion, as I would describe it, that markets lead to optimal resource allocations. It is in the interface between governance and the functioning of markets that societies have always progressed. The notion that somehow governance, starting at the level of a family, starting at the level of a community, and today in the 21st century happening at the global level, is a fundamental condition for markets to actually function for societies. And our capacity to shape markets is not one that should be informed by the failed experiments of socialism or, quite frankly, by the failed experiments of Wall Street exuberance. It should actually be informed by a very hard-nosed analysis of the patterns of development in the 20th century and even in the last few years. Let me give you one example. if I had stood in this room here in the first year that the Hertie School had started its work, and I would have said to you that in the year 2012, the total investment in clean energy will be more than the total investment in oil, gas, and coal put together, you would have laughed at me. I probably would never have gotten my job because, I would have left this lecture with the, characterization that this person doesn't know what he's talking about. Now, it will not surprise you, I wouldn't cite this figure if it actually has happened. In the year 2012, total investment in clean energy in the world was close to $250 billion. Despite financial crisis, despite economic crisis, it has grown by 11%. Now, the fascinating fact is that we have achieved in the global energy technology market, and that's why, again, I want to very much welcome the focus that you have put forward, through, first of all, the recognition of a scientifically underpinned phenomenon. And I call it phenomenon because climate change, if you want to have the luxury of still debating it, by all means do. We will never have perfect proof of a phenomenon as complex as global warming and climate change. But it was enough to just be able to draw the perspective of the next 100 years to our societies to be able to convince them that there was such a major risk that investing in a precautionary approach to the future of our energy supplies had become something that is warranted. And through very simple regulatory, fiscal, and sectoral policy interventions by governments, did we begin to create the economic and incentive structure for a massive refocusing of energy investments, to the point where the given technologies that were essentially and are still being sold to us by many as the only energy options we have available have actually become the driver of technology innovation, of efficiency, and also of innovation, and of new jobs. The other interesting phenomenon is that what began originally as a kind of experimental, as the United States was very good at putting new technologies in California to work and to see whether Californians at least would take them on and then maybe take them to the world market, then began to have the center of action in Europe. And Denmark, Germany, Norway, some of the Scandinavian countries at the forefront of putting in place the regulatory frameworks, the Energieeinspeisungsgesetz. If as a foreigner you ever manage to say that without stumbling, then you have conquered German. The feed-in tariff structure, but also the public confidence, and that is critical, that this was not a technology dream, but actually it was a technology that was ready for deployment, and you now had a social and economic choice to make. I am always perplexed when I listen to the current debate in Germany about the so-called Energiewende, because clearly in trying to make such a fundamental transition happen, there will be winners and losers. How do we address those? Some elements are in place. There will be costs that will arise that, yes, may also need correcting. But what Germany has achieved just in the last 8 to 10 years was unimaginable to any energy economist just 10 years ago. That it would close down all its nuclear power stations, that it would put in place a renewable energy infrastructure that would produce probably by next year 1/4 of the entire electricity consumption of this country, that even while closing down and making that transition would become a net energy exporter at a higher level than before, and therefore be able to run an energy transition in this economy that would not destroy jobs, run out of electricity, and in a sense drive a whole technology innovation wave. Yes, we are seeing just now also the fallout from that, competition on the global planet. Solar companies, solar technology made in Germany is struggling. But this is, in a sense, to me, a little bit odd that economists are very surprised, because this is nothing new. Look at the consolidation of the automotive industry, the steel industry. Jobs and businesses and production centers keep on shifting in the global economy. The question is an economy such as Germany able to capitalize on not just a technology, but in fact on an energy system transition? Because therein lies, in a sense, the power and the capital that Germany has accumulated in being a globally competitive economy. So technology is not just a function of clever inventors or big hedge funds that put their money behind it. It is principally and primarily, actually, in terms of scaling up and getting energy into the market a function of public policy, of creating the markets, of correcting for distortions, of addressing the $600 or $700 billion that we currently invest in actually encouraging people to use fossil fuels. We have a factor of 8 to 9 times more money being paid out by governments on the planet every day today for people to use more fossil fuels rather than actually use more renewable energy and invest in energy efficiency. Because the total public expenditure worldwide is roughly about $60 to $70 billion in terms of subsidies and stimulus packages for renewable energy and energy efficiency. So here you have an example again of how at the national level public policy is fundamental to driving technology, is fundamental to enabling an economy in a rational transition path to begin to address planetary realities. And that same logic extends also to the global arena, and that is why I want to end my presentation to you this evening by making a very strong plea that yes, multilateralism needs to be reinvented, and our processes of establishing global governance platforms, accountabilities, are in need of reform. But to blame multilateralism for the failure of nation states to be able to address these issues in the economic paradigm of today is perhaps looking at the wrong problem. And therefore, a school, and that is also my reason why I was so grateful and pleased when you extended this invitation, a school that is focused on governance is as critical to the future of business, to the future of energy, to the functioning of our global economy, to world trade, as is the entrepreneurial spirit, the investor's capital, the technology ingenuity of societies that are constantly producing new patents. And I would hope that in trying to understand the crisis we face in a planetary context today, in the governance context, but also in the financial and economic markets, we do not walk away from the understanding that being able to make a difference in the coming years is very much something that has to do with public policy being reinvented, re-engineered, and rethought, and not allowing the simplistic economic drivers of whether in the form of indicators such as GDP growth or that environmental standards kill jobs. I would challenge anyone here to actually do an economic analysis of the last 20 years, because this is my hypothesis. I just haven't had the time to do my PhD on this, but I have a lot of evidence that much of the environmental regulations and norms and standards that have been introduced in our economies over the last 20 years are in fact, as a net balance sheet factor, positive to our economies because they have raised resource efficiency tremendously. They have reduced waste enormously. Even in terms of lawyers sitting in companies, they have reduced legal liabilities. And they've actually driven innovation and created new jobs. So that specter of the environmentalists being anti-economy is not only a false premise in the first place, it is actually not borne out by even some of the strictest standards that have driven the automotive industry, the energy sector, agriculture, water users, to reinvent the way they use these resources. I could give you a lot more examples, but I think now it's time for questions and answers, challenges, disagreements. I hope that sort of quick journey across a very complex and rich topic has given you at least a flavor of my outlook on some of these issues, the lessons that I learn, and my deep conviction that in a, yes, often seemingly dysfunctional system, I am a deep believer in the idea of multilateralism, not as the dictatorship of the bureaucrat, but as the only avenue in which to reconcile the interests of enormously differing realities of people, societies, and economies. And governance is, if you want, the DNA, the red thread, the spinal cord of, in a sense, being able to address many of these issues. In the talk that we have prepared, and I had also tried to cover some of the aspects here, there are many other elements. We will distribute that or make it available through your website also afterwards. So forgive me if I haven't covered everything here, but I wanted to focus a little bit more also on this economy, environment, technology, and governance nexus. Thank you very much. time. Let me first of all say I didn't dwell much tonight on what happened at Rio because I presume that this is sort of baseline stuff that you know. Let me just say that the document, The Future We Want, is worth reading 3 times. One, to be shocked, in a sense, at the inability of leaders to articulate clear directions for the future of the planet. That's the first reflex that many have when they, in a sense, think of Rio plus 20. A second time, to begin to understand that actually this document covers a remarkable range of arenas in which development will be defined nationally, regionally, and globally in the coming years, and they are all there in even, I would argue, a slightly more mature, comprehensive way than they were in Agenda 21. And thirdly, to read it one more time to detect actually where in between the lines you can notice significant and less significant shifts in the way that Rio tried to articulate the state of play. And please remember, these summits are simply an event. The sustainable development discourse is an intergenerational conversation, a policy struggle that is defined sometimes by short-term phenomena such as financial crisis or the US-China relationship and other things. But I think the Rio conferences, even going back Stockholm, Rio 92, Johannesburg 2000 to Rio plus 20 this year or last year, are an interesting journey of a world essentially reluctantly but with increasing clarity recognizing the need to act collectively. And I would argue that environmental sustainability actually came out of Rio strengthened in 2012. In 1992 it was there, the Brundtland report, I mean it was a consciousness issue, it was the 3 pillars, but it was 3 pillars, and amongst the 3 pillars the environmental pillar was the poor cousin, and social issues was the second poorest cousin, and then there was the economic uncle who essentially defined the arena for sustainable development. We also saw the upgrading of UNEP, I think, not as an isolated event, and yes, some were looking for the World Environment Organization. Given that it took us 40 years to accept that environmental governance actually may be something that functioning economies require, also global economy, I would interpret the decisions in Rio as a significant step towards recognizing the centrality of environmental issues in the future governance of international relations as much as economic relations. And UNEP now is the only entity within the UN Secretariat of funds and programs that actually has the equivalent of the membership of the General Assembly. To some that may not mean much, but I take it more as a signal, as so many things in multilateralism are political signals. We saw that decision of Rio also being the first one that was first of all taken up by the General Assembly, implemented by the environment ministers and approved in terms of renaming the Governing Council, which was just a group of 58 countries governing UNEP, into a United Nations Environment Assembly this February and confirmed by the General Assembly just 4 weeks later in New York. This is by multilateral terms almost unprecedented in terms of the speed. So I think, yes, environmental governance has been strengthened. I think it is a symptomatic signal of recognizing that we need to actually find ways of strengthening international governance. And when you say Montreal could be a curse, why would you say that? Because I would argue that the functionality of these treaties is one defined by how they are, in a sense, enabled to function. And the success of Montreal was the convergence of public, private, and scientific knowledge actually about being able to implement these changes. The necessity to address the ozone hole. Secondly, the availability of technology, and therefore also the private sector and the markets being able to do it. And thirdly, a financial mechanism that was essentially allowing developing countries who did not really have a responsibility for the ozone hole, this also goes to the legacy pollution question, to be compensated for having to phase out this stuff much quicker. And I think we could actually renegotiate dozens of Montreal protocols even in the year 2012, 2013, because the problem is not in the instrument of environmental governance. The problem is more in how nation states are, in a sense, perceiving international environmental governance of being in their national interest. The reason why we failed in Copenhagen was not that we had some extraordinary leap to undertake, but that a number of countries made a very hard-nosed calculation that they had more to gain by the world not having a global climate treaty in place and buying themselves time. And this is not just a phenomenon of a developing country psychology, but also of some of the richest countries on the planet, and therefore actually deliberately preventing a climate agreement from being reached, even though the majority of nations were prepared and ready to move. So I think much of the future environmental governance will be premised on being able to establish a common and collective interest in actually acting and transacting through multilateral agreements. And this is where, Sandeep, I think, your question on, the rule of law or what you said, the legal frameworks. I believe that environmental governance will begin to migrate very quickly from the sort of soft law and aspirational agreements that we have to increasingly being a framework for action embedded in an understanding of the rule of law, the rule of international environmental law, which creates the confidence and the trust that if you sign up to this, you will actually not be screwed. Because the perception of much of international north-south relations is that both sides seem to be convinced that the other side is actually taking them to the cleaners. It's one of those strange psychologies that humanity obviously passes through. And therefore, the rule of law creates accountability. Accountability creates transparency. Transparency creates trust. And then the delivery of something like the Montreal Protocol becomes a self-propelling vehicle where everybody benefits from. And should countries sometimes move forward with initiatives such as aviation emissions, I think there is no universal answer to that. I personally think that those countries who oppose aviation emissions have a real case to answer, because this is not a poverty issue. This is not a livelihood issue. This is actually the richest 2% choosing air travel as a way to conduct their business across the world or their leisure time. To not make the aviation sector one of, which is one of the fastest growing emission sectors actually in our global economy, a part of the solution towards a low carbon pathway is, I think, to me, inexcusable. But, can Europe simply move ahead? Well, clearly it was shown the red card and it got worried. And that just shows how interdependent we are, that even a bloc of 500 million people, which has the runways in its territory, cannot simply say we're going to put a carbon tax on this. So complex. The issue of the commons, if you take issues such as the marine and ocean realm at the moment, one of the fascinating and depressing facts is that instruments such as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was the vehicle for, if you want, bundling global efforts to actually protect and sustainably use and manage marine resources, has increasingly become paralyzed because, and I go back to the phenomenon that I described earlier on, the modus of engagement in evolving the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is far more informed at the moment by preventing measures from being taken that could go against your national interest of free access to the commons than it actually is about governing the marine resources and ecosystems. And it is creating a legal impasse that, however, is not rooted in lawyers' perceptions of the marine issues, but in very hard-nosed economic interests that are preventing even some of the most rational and fundamental steps from being taken. The same phenomenon you can see in the interface between international instruments such as regional fisheries management agreements and organizations, which are resource use-driven instruments, and a conservation-driven instrument such as the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And we just saw finally, after decades, a breakthrough of actually allowing fisheries issues to really begin to become part of the CITES instrument, because if the user-driven regulatory instrument is failing, we have to migrate species and ecosystems into a conservation-driven regulatory framework. And by all means, if the population is stabilized, let it be taken back to the user-driven framework. And it speaks to the simple fact that if you take a bluefin tuna today, the notion that economic intelligence will actually drive the economy to protecting a species threatened with extinction is simply not working. Currently, one bluefin tuna sells at $250,000, one fish. who will stop buying the most expensive vessel and the greatest tank of diesel to go out there and find that last bluefin tuna if you can get $250,000, or maybe in 2 or 3 years' time, when there is only a few thousand left, you might get $1 million. This is the economics of resource use in the global commons. Is it a tragedy? No, I think it is, in a sense, a drama that is playing itself out, and I would not yet write off the drama in the sense that it will be an implosion. I think humans are far more intelligent and rational, and again, my whole discourse with UNEP today around the green economy is to make people understand that environmental rational actions are actually economically rational and therefore are not in contradiction. The minute you establish that, a Montreal Protocol starts working. I'm convinced of that.
Let's take one more. Right, I think you were next, and one question in brief, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much for generously sharing your time and thoughts with us this evening. My name's Johnny West, and I'm a student here at Hertie. So my question concerns the role of democracy, and specifically, is democracy the optimal governance structure for achieving effective and efficient action on the environment? And I address this provocative question to your own provocative use as China, as an example of leadership on environmental action, and also to the behavioral and political economy constraints that you discussed in your lecture. Thank you very much.
So if we take 3 questions from this side, you first. And then you're next.
Well, my name is Anna Hartmann. I'm an adjunct professor here at the Hertie School. Thank you for this great talk. I had an equally inspiring talk today with Professor von Weizsäcker, and there was a lot of resonating. But I wanted to try out one position which Professor von Weizsäcker said today on you, namely, I heard you make a strong plea for global governance, multilateralism, to advance in the agenda. I think we all agree on that, and I certainly heard that also this afternoon in the lunch discussion with Professor von Weizsäcker as the first best solution. Nonetheless, we are faced with a stalemate and lack of dynamism in that. And is there a possibility for nation states or selected groupings of nation states to set agendas, take restructuring, introduce some incentives to charge ahead of the global agenda and dynamize this process and maybe create some of the incentives which you described in terms of environmental standards, which you said were not environmentally detrimental, but set new standards, create a demand for new energies. And more bluntly, how would you convince a politician to do that? With what arguments?
I was calling it the coalition of the willing.
Sounds familiar.
My name is Franziska Otte. I'm a second-year student here at the Hertie School, and my question actually relates very much to that, because I would be interested in the way you would evaluate unilateral interstate alliances. That is, some kind of a coalition of the willing that go ahead in environmental protection, maybe also as a way to foster multilateralism, in the sense that these unilateral alliances might serve as a testing ground, probably for certain environmental policy tools that might later on also be implemented on the multilateral stage.
Yeah. Is it okay to take one more question? So you're done. Thank you.
Thank you. Christian Flaxland from the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. Also a bit in this direction. My question is also on the role of scientists in this whole game, so to speak. So your narrative was starting from the premise of global goals not being achieved, obstacles, you mentioned Wall Street, and then looking at first best principles, so to speak. But wouldn't it be useful to look a bit more on this in-between issue of the political economy dimension, of conflicting multiple objectives of different agents, distributional issues, strategic considerations in our research, but also then bringing this into our assessment reports, such as GEO, such as IPCC. So the question is, would you find this a useful avenue for research? And do you think this is a feasible route in view of the multilateral assessment processes we have? Thank you.
Let me start with the last question, because that one I can answer very easily, absolutely yes. And I would argue that much of what I have tried to sort of describe as a landscape from not the vantage point of the researcher, not the vantage point of the commentator, but of the vantage point of somebody who is trapped in the middle of this unfolding drama is that much of what I try to draw your attention to tonight is actually the political economy of environmentalism in the 21st century, with a strong emphasis on economy, not just in the political science sense, but actually also on the empirical dimension to political economy, which I think is far more conducive to an environmental and sustainability rationale today than we could have produced even 10 or 20 years ago. So absolutely, I think, much of what I think will help us gain the confidence of people in our society is that transitions and transformations, which are essential in an analytical sense, are also viable in a perceived sense as a citizen, as a income earner, as somebody who wants to educate their children, who wants to retire and not be on Social Security. These are, in a sense, the litmus tests against which we have to test it, as much as can we answer the question of global poverty in an economy 20 years from now that will still see a continent like Africa with 1 billion people that will not have access to electricity. I mean, more than 3/4 of Africa's population does not have access to electricity. What is the energy economy, globally speaking, that will allow access to energy, greater energy efficiency, low carbon and lower carbon footprints, not just in relative terms, but in absolute terms? So yes, simple answer, absolutely. Let me go maybe backwards, because the question of interstate alliances, coalition of the willing, I think the simple answer is much of multilateralism has always evolved from the coalition of the willing. It is interesting that the perception of the United Nations today and the General Assembly is essentially one of a divided world that is not able to come together, that engages in petty conflicts to the evening newsreader, or in fundamental impasses such as in the Security Council, when indeed the image of the United Nations in the 1960s and early 1970s and even through the 1950s was the most progressive force and place on the planet, whether in terms of human rights, decolonization, basic economic development, international economic solidarity, the right to development, a fundamental discourse both in terms of international law and multilateralism, as much as it is a part of the discourse that captured North-South discussions. So I think multilateralism and the coalition of the willing, the interstate alliances, the group of countries that come together is always going to be the departure point. But, and the reason why I would argue that this is not a contradiction, if indeed we need to develop policies and instruments, including allocating carbon space in the atmosphere, fisheries rights and mineral exploitations rights in the global commons of the oceans, or indeed food on the global market, then what actually is becoming increasingly obvious is that you cannot achieve a global transformation with only a few players. Look at the G20. And this is, the skeptical multilateralist had their dream come true when in the midst of the financial crisis, the G20 finally emerged. Look at the powerlessness of even the G20 being able to address itself to many of the fundamental issues, even subsidies. 3 times already we have looked at fossil fuel subsidies at G20 summits. There are declarations that commit countries to phasing them out. They're actually at their highest level probably in the course of last year and this year. And these are not even the fundamental banking and financial markets issues. Look at the Major Economies Forum in the climate change arena. 80% of the emissions you could actually address on the planet with just, 18, 19 countries. This Major Economies Forum has been meeting for the last 5 years. It was, at the time, President Bush's proposition of a coalition of the willing, the alternative to the protracted, corrupted multilateral negotiation process. So even in that almost self-compelling coalition, progress has not really happened. Third reason why multilateralism is important, it's not only the big ones who matter on this planet. I joined the United Nations out of a deep conviction that it stood for the principle that every citizen's rights on this planet count. Climate policy reduced down to a group of willing actors essentially means dividing the future of the planet up amongst a small group of self-interested players. coalitions of the willing are not self-interested players. And the fact of the matter is that some of the people who have to bear the heaviest cost of inaction on global warming or speculative food markets are not the ones who will shape those decisions. Now, this is not a contradiction to coalitions of the willing. As I said, I think coalitions of the willing should not define themselves as an alternative to multilateralism and therefore the accountability and the representativity and the legitimacy that it provides, but they should actually accept the responsibility to lead. And here I have to say some of the self-declared leaders of coalitions of the willing are found extremely wanting in terms of leadership, and actually are in some cases even reneging on their claims to global leadership. So the crisis of multilateralism is not one that is unique to the multilateral arena. Please take a hard look at coalitions of the willing and then ask yourself, what is their best contribution that they can make? And the fact that, even a state such as California is often miles ahead of the rest of the United States, working in partnership. Arnold Schwarzenegger at the time, wonderful image, meeting with Tony Blair and essentially initiating climate action. And you can find many of these coalitions of the willing, I think are essential to multilateralism. But they're not an alternative, especially when you're trying to find an equitable and fair and globally scalable solution to these challenges. So I hope that gives you a sense of how I interpret both their viability, and therefore Ernst and I think, have absolutely no disagreement on that. I think it is a question of phasing, of the chronology, and in a sense the moving ahead. And what I described earlier on, United States, Europe, now Asia, in terms of environmental policy, investment and technology progression, is actually not always a single state issue. It is very often actually a coalition of the willing, sometimes regionally defined also. And that, I think, was the question on interstate alliances. The question of democracy. If the camera wasn't on now, I would say to you, no, you cannot make democracy a simple correlation with environmental sustainability. Because neither democracies nor dictatorships have, in a sense, a uniform record of either having been successful or failing at addressing these issues. It's just like I've often argued that the green economy as a concept, or ecological sustainability, has not been a function of capitalism or socialism being more effective at addressing it. Indeed, the notion of a transition towards a green economy, the work that also Ernst and the Wuppertal Institute have done on factor 10, etc., factor 4, are as usable or have been as ignorable in any governance system. And therefore, governance in itself, I don't think determines capacity to act. What democracy, however, does is create accountability. And I think in any social system, my preference would always be for maximum accountability. As citizens, we have rights. To defend those rights with the due process of courts and constitutional rights is fundamental in the end to an accountable government and a functioning society in terms of our individual rights as citizens. And that is a progression that every society has to work out in its political economy, in its social and political processes. But I think what I am trying to say to you very carefully is, do not step on a pedestal and point from one country, society, political system to another and necessarily lecture them on the principles of governance in terms of how societies govern themselves. Because if you're trying to make a correlation between good environmental governance and good democracy, you'll have to answer a lot of questions about what's happened to environmental governance in very good democracies. So that's my cautious answer to that.